Hello and welcome to What the Luxe with me, Fred Moore.
And me, Anand Sharma.
Together we lead Matter of Form, a design consultancy specialising in brand, digital experience and content. And this is a podcast that calls time on tired ideas of luxury.
Alongside industry luminaries and thought leaders, we explore what truly defines category-leading products and services. I'm delighted for this episode of What the Luxe to have David Burke, who has the enviable role as Chief Exec of the London Philharmonic Orchestra, join us. David, thank you so much for coming down to Shoreditch.
My pleasure.
David, can we just, you've had this amazing personal career journey. Can you talk to that and what's led you to the role that you're in now?
I think it's a combination of passion and stubbornness that sort of brought me here. In some ways, it started at university. I created the first ever degree in management of music, which are two things I'm passionate about, and didn't happen nowhere was producing that qualification, and I managed to convince Royal Holloway, University of London, to create a degree especially for me, not knowing about this side of the industry, and that's what I wanted to do. It's just two things I cared about, and I managed to push that through and convince them. And then from there, I volunteered at a festival and met some musicians and said, could you help us put on some concerts? And so I did that, but worked in a pub and did a bit of teaching around the side to cover rent. But obviously did that well enough that they recommended me to friends, and soon I had a whole portfolio of freelance chamber groups that I was sort of managing and promoting concerts for. And so I did that for a few years. After that, I said to move up a stretch and joined a company called English Touring Opera, which is, I think at the time, about 15 people, national organisation, and spent 7 years there as a general manager, in effect. And then got a call about the job at London Philharmonic. And I spent 10 years there as general manager and finance director before the chief exec role came up, and then stepped up at the start of COVID.
What an amazing tenure. It's also so great that you've been there for so long. You know, it's so rare these days to spend so long within an organisation, really understanding its fabric and starting, from a role that turns into a chief exec role.
Yeah, I don't know quite how it's been so long, so quickly it's flown by, but it's an amazing organisation. There's very few places, when you hit the top, it's very hard to see where you would go next, and the people are truly special. It's a very unique place. So I had calls before I got the chief exec role from other places, but there was nowhere that would inspire me in the way that the LPO has. So I hung around.
What sowed the seed for your love of this style of music?
Oh, God, when I was a kid, I was at 7, I think everyone gets given a recorder. I played the recorder. At the age of 8, I was given the opportunity to play the clarinet.
Forgot about the recorder.
Of course. Yeah, everyone's had that moment.
Do people still learn the recorder? Yeah. Is that still a thing?
Yeah. It's a great starting point because they're cheap, they're affordable, you can't damage them. And it just gets the mind, the emotion in. Not that I could say loving playing the recorder was the key driver. But then I moved on to the clarinet and played, and God, by the time I was in my teens, I think I was in about 8 or 9 different orchestras and bands and just playing all the time. It's always been a huge part of my life.
Is the clarinet your thing?
Clarinet, saxophone, piano.
Of course. And the recorder.
Of
course. Can you tell us a bit about the LPO? You've obviously been there 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
What's the history of it? I mean, it's got a fascinating history. What's the history of it? What have been your personal career highlights?
Well, the orchestra was founded in 1932 by Sir Thomas Beecham. At the time, there was only, I think, 2 other orchestras in London, and he was frustrated, and he said, I want to form an orchestra of the best players in London to rival the Philharmonics, the orchestras in Berlin and Vienna, which were the 2 top ones. And so he set up the orchestra. But what was really fascinating, sort of in 32, about 6-7 years later, he left to go to the States for some rest and recuperation. He was in ill health, and the orchestra, and then the war started.
Place, I seem to remember.
Yes, exactly.
Take some respite in a sunny place.
Yeah.
But then the war happened.
And then the war happened, and his backers, who had been supporting the orchestra, turned their money into the war effort. The orchestra almost collapsed, and we had a communist principal viola player called Thomas Russell, and he said, let's form a collective. And so at that point, the players took over the orchestra, and they ran it themselves. They did all the bookings themselves, and they took all the artistic decisions themselves. And that is still true to the spirit today. We're still a collective. We're owned by the musicians. I effectively report to 80 bosses. And but that spirit is still that was sort of fundamental to how we exist.
Beecham, it was Beecham, wasn't it? Sorry, yeah, he sort of came back and was forced into sort of being an employee, and didn't last very long.
No, and he came back after the war and said, "Look, hi everyone, I'm back now, ready to take over." And actually, we quite like this running ourselves. And so, after that, he then went and formed the Royal Philharmonic.
Yes.
So he famously created 2 great orchestras.
And during the war, I believe it was bombed, wasn't it? And all of the instruments were destroyed, and there was a call put out, I think, by the BBC to get people to donate their instruments. And there was an overwhelming response. It was so loved by society at large.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. It was famously the Queen's Hall, which is in Westminster. It was probably the last great hall we've had in London, and as you say, it was bombed with all our instruments there. I mean, there's footage of people walking down the street with instrument cases to give them back so the orchestra could continue.
It was a real part of popular culture.
Yeah.
At the time. What do you feel its role is today, and how has it changed?
I think the world has got a lot more complex. There are so many different opportunities to just even genres of music. I think Spotify's latest count was over 6,000 different types of music. Different entertainment formats, different things to do with your time, and it's finding our niche within that. I think actually fundamentally that hasn't changed. It's providing exceptional high quality music which inspires and emotes, brings on emotion, and so that's the same. But it's finding our place in doing that. So whether that's live performance or broadcast or online and digital and streaming on social, and finding all those particular moments.
To play for 4.5 hours, it's quite a feat.
Yeah.
It requires a lot of very skillful endurance athletes.
Yeah, completely. when they do it at Bayreuth, at home at Wagner, they have 2 orchestras and they switch at the half time.
Do they?
In effect,
That's fascinating.
But yeah, it's pretty extreme. The orchestral members of the LPO are phenomenal, absolutely dedicated to their craft.
What's a day in the life for them?
Well, typically, we start rehearsals at 10:30. They'll arrive at the hall at horn players probably at about 9:30 to start getting their lips into the right place. Most of them will turn up at 10. You rehearse for 3 hours, take a break another 3 hours, and then go back home and then do your individual practice on bits that aren't quite right and sat there. But, we, over a course of a week, you don't have a typical week. I think that's what's lovely about it and interesting for them. We have, at the moment, we're down at Glyndebourne, so with a resident orchestra there. And so they're doing opera every night, but then we'll come out in the morning and perhaps do a community session or going into a school or work some of the projects we're doing in that arena. We tour quite a lot. And touring's quite, again, intensive. You do 3 or 4 hours travel plus 3 hour rehearsal and then a performance and then on to the next city the next day. But it's all fun.
Do you rehearse on the day that you do the performance?
Yeah.
Of course you do, I suppose, because you have not performances every day, presumably.
Well, no, we do probably 150 performances a year. So it's 1 every 3 days on average. But it's generally often only on the day that you get into the actual hall where you'll be performing. And so you need to rehearse just to get used to the specific acoustics and that real detail.
Yeah. And how big is the biggest orchestra?
I think, we did Marlowe 8 a couple of years ago, and we do Marlowe 8 next season as well. And I think that's famously called Symphony of 1,000. I think the orchestra's about 150, 160, and then 3 choirs as well.
That's a
lot.
It's
epic sound.
That's a lot of people to manage. How has your role changed from being general manager to chief exec?
I was really lucky. So I was general manager for nearly 10 years, and I had a really supportive chief exec who, effectively, I was minister with that portfolio. Okay. And he just said, find where there are gaps, there's stuff where you can help and do that. And so I worked across the whole company. I wrote the business plans. I worked on big brand strategy campaigns and things like that. So it was a really fantastic opportunity to develop without quite the same pressure of ultimate responsibility that sits with the chief exec. Were you on the tour bus? I did a bit. I'm doing a lot more touring now.
Really? As chief exec, really?
Yeah, because when you're on tour, it's a good time to see the players and to catch up because it's so intense when you're in London. But also, you've got key promoters and partners overseas that you want to see and catch up with.
Yeah.
So it's more, I think the role of chief executive rather than general manager is also that figurehead. It's the outward facing conversations and introductions and networking and stuff that is probably more new and the responsibility.
You mentioned brand strategy there and working on that in your role as general manager. What is the brand strategy for the London Philharmonic? What do you think about when you're defining the brand?
Well, it's interesting that when I did that, it was about 8 or 9 years ago. We worked with a guy called Al McCuish. You may know he's who was on the board for a while, and at the time, we do such a broad range of stuff. Recordings. I talked about some of the community and education work.